Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, May 21st, 2013, and this is Capitol Conversations. I'm Marty Owings. Well, it's quiet right now here at the Capitol as lawmakers ended the legislative session in the early dawn hours this morning, but not before a rush of new laws, including some controversial measures, were passed. We'll take a look back at the legislative session tonight through the eyes of a freshman legislator and bring you up to speed on all the latest developments from the Capitol in the last few days of all the action up here. As always, we invite you, the viewer, to participate in our interactive weekly political talk show. Just send us a tweet or a question on Facebook at Minnesota Capitol Conversations, or just tweet us at MNCap News. I'd like to welcome in GOP Representative David FitzSimmons in his first term. He's a freshman lawmaker up here. And welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me again,
Thank
Marty.
you for being here, David FitzSimmons. And well, I guess let's start off with you. The DFL had a pretty ambitious agenda. I mean, say what you want about whether you like it or don't like it. They had an ambitious agenda, and it seems like they took full advantage of being in control up here. From your perspective, just from a purely political standpoint, not wearing the jersey, were they effective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they were able to move a lot of legislation and a lot of projects that they've maybe wanted to do for years and had the opportunity and certainly seized on it. Although I think they also found places where they ran into the limits of that ability. I mean, we saw some of Governor Dayton's early tax proposals really get so resisted, I think, by the general public, and legislators felt it and turned on their leadership on those issues. So some of the expansion of sales tax on clothing and the business to business transactions.
Yeah, we'll talk in a minute
alcohol,
about some of that snuck in, but
sure, some things came back, but I think there was also the realization that you got to be careful because the public's never more than an election away. Right.
Well, speaking of that, your caucus, the GOP, even though they were in a minority, were effective insofar as they were able to block some things that would have otherwise maybe just gone through had they not been here. Can you talk about what the specifics are around those?
Sure, and I mean, obviously, setting the stage, it's in a pretty minimal tools situation.
Right, you're pretty restricted.
The Republicans are with the minority in both chambers and without the executive office. Again, it's a situation that no minority party's seen in 20 years. So it was.
I don't even know if there's a legislator on the Republican side that ever saw it.
Probably not on the Republican side. Yeah. You'd probably have to talk to Lyndon Carlson and Phyllis Kahn.
That's right. Yeah.
To hear much about those days. So very limited ability. Obviously, I think on the bonding issue, there was some leverage point there that ended up being used and was something that had to be contended with. And I think both the House and Senate Republicans, were able to take some advantage of that and get some concessions on things. And obviously there's a lot of meetings and rooms that I wasn't in either. So your guess.
A lot of the Republicans weren't, right? I mean, they weren't really invited to the table at all. And,
right.
And where there was consultation, it was almost an afterthought.
Well, and that's where I think potentially you again look at the Democrats needed Republican votes on bonding. It was something that everybody said from the beginning of the year, and I think they were.
Yeah, they needed a little late.
I think they were a little late or a little underestimated the difficulty in peeling members off. Of a caucus that was gonna that knew from the beginning that was their one trump card. Right. So I think they underestimated how much they needed to include the Republicans on something and make some kind of arrangement with the bonding and how that interplayed with some other things. I think they underestimated that until it was obviously too late on the first go around, and then realized it and did come up with something on the second.
Well, even from Monday morning quarterback in this a little bit, from a pragmatic standpoint, it would have made better sense maybe for the Democrats to cultivate those relationships throughout the session rather than wait, as you say, until the last minute, then come and say, hey, will you help us out a little, especially given the fact that, there was things going on in committee hearings,
Right.
like you guys weren't being given the legislation until the same time the public was given
Right.
it. Just common courtesies that you would normally expect from
Right.
adults in a
Conference committees, many
legislature.
conference committees contain no Republicans.
Right.
And that's, I think that's a situation, and that was a way that I think the Democrats set the game up this go around that potentially is in their purview to do, but maybe not the wisest choice long term.
Right.
I
regardless of political ideologies.
Yeah, and I think Minnesotans too do have a traditional view of liking to see bipartisanship. They like to have things not be all one way or all the other, and I think there is a little of a sense that the Democrats simply ran the show the way they wanted to, and dealing with any counter view was not something they were interested in.
Well, just to finish up on that point, would it have made sense to have, obviously that cooperation right from the beginning, but couldn't Republicans have been more effective in the reform aspect? Because I think that's what the DFL is being criticized for right now, even by some in their own ranks, is that there wasn't maybe enough. I'm talking about conservative Democrats or more
Right.
moderate Democrats who are saying, look, well, not to belabor the point, but you want to pay back an $800 million deficit. It's a temporary situation, a deficit is.
Right.
But you pay it back with taxes that remain in perpetuity
Right.
forever,
Yep.
which how does, that's not a reform-minded type agenda.
No, and I think there was a lot of overreach on the tax
Yeah,
front.
that's not an editorial. I'm just, these
No,
are facts.
Yeah, absolutely. Taxes are most often permanent. Whether
They
we
usually
like them
don't
or
go
not.
down.
They rarely go
Rarely
down.
go
They
down,
rarely
yeah.
are eliminated.
Yeah.
And so, part of the thing too is, when you look at individuals and they making their choices, long-term choices, when you look at businesses in how they do long-term planning, it isn't always just what the result is; it's what the proposals are, and so that's, I think, concerning in taxation. Virtually every proposed tax imaginable was proposed, and I think that's a very unsettling signal to send a business that they're not sure what's around the corner then, or really that there's any top end limit on where the majority party is willing to tax. And I think that's worrisome to me that those signals get sent to business when at the end of the day we need businesses to produce a tax revenue that's essential, and the jobs that also produce the tax revenue. And I think in the pursuit of the golden egg, you better be careful you don't kill the goose.
Yeah, I absolutely, I understand that's how your party would view it, and I think even some of the Democrats have voiced some concern with that. Of course,
Right.
they kind of had to hurt a lot of cats this year. So if you talk
Absolutely.
about the job that Speaker Thiessen had to do, or some of his challenges, you had Republicans or Democrats who may align more with Republicans in some cases, depending on their districts, and we
Yep.
saw that most notably on some of the votes that took place on some of the social issues.
Right.
But to your point, did it occur to you at any time that maybe that you were going to get more Democrats on that side of the aisle on certain issues? I mean, did your caucus count on that?
I think I think everybody knows how it works. So, and the majority party does. They control the agenda, and they're going to pick the time and the place and the hour of battle, and so when they do, it's unlikely that they're going to have something that does not make it through. Which was why things like the bonding bill was a bit of a surprise, because it rarely happens. Rarely is a measure brought up by the majority party and not have the votes necessary.
Well, they needed a super majority in that
Correct.
case.
I mean, they need
two-thirds.
Yes, so they needed 8 Republican votes.
Yeah.
But again, to not make sure that happens is or not have some great assurances that that's
Yeah.
going to happen is a dangerous game to play for a majority to bring a measure forward. That's not going to. And you look at, I think the closest one we had was the child care unionization.
Right,
That
yeah.
was one vote from failing. Every single one of the 68 Democrats was the deciding vote on that.
Yeah.
And obviously, with looking at Gene Pawlowski and Tina Liebling and Kim Norton being three, more senior members that were against that, I think it showed probably the uneasy nature of that in the caucus. I think there were a lot of members that are concerned about that because, again, it goes to, you can claim it's not a direct tax, but if you increase the cost on people that use daycare, you're not talking about the top 2%. It's you're talking about everyday, working class, single parents, two-parent working families that are burning the midnight oil on both ends, and now you're going to add another cost to them on what it's going to cost for them to have their kids at a daycare. These are things that hit everyday people.
Well, it occurred to me that you just made the same argument about daycare unionization that Democrats sit here and make about LGA cuts.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I think if you talk to a Republican privately, they understand that LGA cuts are going to translate into some kind of, they're going to have to get tax from
Sure.
some revenue from somewhere, but they'll never say it publicly,
Right.
well, that's not the way it works.
Right.
But, and most Democrats that sit in a chair won't say that unionizing the daycare necessarily translates, in their defense,
Right.
into increase. But, when you think about the agenda that the Republicans had, now you weren't here in your defense, but
Correct.
before, and then laser focused by the DFL to say, from a political standpoint, I'm so interested in talking to you about this because you're a strategist as well. And if people don't know, David FitzSimmons was also the chair for the Emmer campaign, right? You were his campaign manager.
Yes.
For quite a bit of the success of the Emmer campaign. And
Yeah, during the endorsement period. Yep.
yes, and then after they changed horses, things started to change a little bit for Representative Emmer. But anyway, long story short, getting back to that point, wouldn't you think they'd, stipulate to the point that maybe that you guys overreached, and then they were laser focused on that overreach, and now they can't claim they didn't do that this year on some of the issues.
Yeah, and I think
Even though we'll talk about your issue in a minute that you voted on to support.
Sure.
But did they overreach on what fronts? Social agenda, taxes, all of them?
I think on a number of them, and
Okay.
and I think they also had a very different situation coming in this year than the Republicans did, obviously, on the fiscal front. I mean,
Right.
coming into 2011, there were severe deficits, facing ones that weren't going to be solved with minor.
It was like
movements.
$6.2 billion
$6.2 billion.
deficit. Yeah.
It was
Tom
roughly
Stinson was depressed every
Right.
time you saw him. Yeah,
roughly
yeah.
10 times the size of what the deficit that we were dealing with in this situation.
Yes.
And so I think the justification then in coming forward with really large scale tax increases,
Yeah.
in using kind of a very relatively minor deficit situation, I think was a little bit of a hard case to make for them, and I think that's something the public's going to have to judge on really what level of tax increase was necessary. Was over $2 billion of tax increases necessary to solve just over a $500 million deficit situation. So.
Let's talk about Governor Dayton's job as you see it from your perspective. What he did, how effective he was as a leader. I mean, he kept some of the promises he made when he set out on the campaign trail, and you know it well. You were on
Sure.
the campaign trail, but he did raise taxes on the wealthiest Minnesotans to create what he characterized as a fairer tax system, and then did put a lot of money into K-12 education and higher ed. But he also broke a pretty key promise, and that was to not use general fund money in the Viking Stadium deal.
Right.
Which, if the public isn't clear on that, can you explain to them a little bit about what happened?
Well, when
there?
the previous deal of the Viking Stadium was built in the last session, it was predicated on a revenue stream from from electronic pull tabs,
Which everybody at the time said,
which many critics
probably
said,
not going to work.
critics said this is not going to work in anywhere near the numbers that you needed
Right.
for what you're projecting, and those critics proved correct.
Turned out they were right, yeah.
You know, turned out they were right. You know, looking at it from this side of it now, it looks like it was maybe a little bit of a case of wishful thinking, or just a way to get something done and fix
Yeah.
the problem later, which is unfortunately is a term too often, I believe, heard around here of, well, let's pass it and we can fix it in conference committee, or let's pass it and we can fix it in the next biennium.
Yeah.
I think passing things that people really believe there is a problem with is a little troubling to me.
Yeah. Well, so what about
So-
this general fund
Well,
money? That's
you know, so then essentially though there was no, and there were attempts to place in a firewall on this thing that wouldn't allow the funding for the Viking
Yeah,
Stadium
no,
to
there
then
were some
go into
amendments
there were some
proposed, yeah.
amendments to propose, and they were voted down, obviously. And so what we had is essentially it goes right back to the taxpayers of Minnesota, that they in the absence of enough e-pull tab revenue, which is the reality we're in right now, by a wide
Magnitudes
margin.
of millions of dollars,
by
yeah.
magnitude of millions. The general fund and the taxpayer Minnesotans have to fill that gap, and they had to go back. And so you can talk about and you know, the governor and Democrats can talk about the top 2%. Which I think originally was top 1%, but it went top 2%, and even that is maybe arguable in some cases. But there were
Well, from your standpoint, at least it wasn't the Senate's proposal.
yes,
Which was $140,000
Right.
for a married couple.
yeah, they
well,
had really, they had
that
really
would have
gone
socked
down
the middle
there.
class.
That's
yeah.
right. But there, you know, some of these things are even yet to know the full impact. Some of the business-to-business taxes that were placed in, some of these storage costs and
Yeah, and
things like that.
electronics. I mean, what does that cover?
Yeah,
You
and
know,
there
yeah.
seems to be really a lot of ambiguity yet in what these things really mean, and a lot of this was crafted in a conference committee, you know, 24 hours before we voted on the floor, and you know, it's sent to the governor to be law. So
Yeah,
these things
right.
happen very rapidly. I don't think a lot of people, even sitting on the floor, realize that you know, storage facilities is really a lot of the things you're going to look at are in agriculture, and you know, my family's in the agriculture business. Storage facilities are used for a lot of things in the
Sure.
commodities, and those are direct drivers onto not only Minnesota's economy. It is usually ranked about the second highest sector in Minnesota's economy on what our economic impact
Talking
is
about
in
agriculture.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
it's a huge portion of.
Yeah, we're an agricultural state.
Correct.
I mean, a lot.
Correct.
Right. yeah.
To a large degree, and especially when one of our other major industries is medical devices, is
Right.
also facing its own hit from
Yeah.
a federal level.
Right.
So, you know, that impact
Hmm.
on agriculture could be massive, and you know, it goes back to the concern with the business-to-business taxes in the first place, and something I think people need to consider, and runs counter to this. It doesn't harm the little guy mantra, is business-to-business taxes they largely fall on smaller business, because the larger the business, typically the more what's called vertical integration has taken
Right.
place, where they own every aspect of what they do.
Mm-hmm.
The smaller the business, the more they have reciprocal
Right, there's a lot more-
contractual
yeah, they have
relationships.
contractors,
And
other people, yeah,
exactly.
yep.
And so the more you get into these business-to-business taxes, really the smaller businesses are who they hit the most. Because even in the case of ag, if you have your own storage facilities and you put your grain in there, you don't pay a tax. But if you're a smaller farmer and you have to rent storage grain facilities,
Then
that's tax. And
then
so
you're taxed.
it's really a regressive tax.
Well, in the governor's favor on this front, or at least the legislatures, they did cut small business taxes, according to their figures, by 346 million or something along those lines. I'm sorry, I don't have that number
Right.
in front of me, but that's my memory of it.
Yeah,
What
there
about
is-
that? Were you encouraged to see some of that take place?
You know,
or-
I think anytime you can get that, it's good. But again, I think it's a little bit of in the face of some some of the other things, especially things that we really
Yeah.
don't know yet. And again, I go back to those storage
Yes.
costs being taxed. One of the other things that's stored a lot is fuel. And
Yeah.
we're obviously seeing everybody paying. I know my price tag just went up about $10 on my tank in the last week and a half.
Right.
So it's
I think a lot of people got hit, but you're not going to blame that on Dayton. That was
No,
not
no,
his fault, right?
No, I'm not. But if you now
Yeah.
have to have even though we didn't have a gas tax, if the gas companies have to pay
Right.
a tax on their storage of the fuel,
Yeah, I see where
which
you're going.
Chair Lincheski even acknowledged there's not taxes on these products, but there's the taxes on the storage of these products. It's hard for that not to translate to the consumer.
Bob Barrett, is a representative colleague of yours,
Yes.
he made the statement that we will now have the 4th highest income tax rate in the country, and when you look how far down the ranks it goes, we are the 2nd highest. That will have an impact on our economy, especially since we have border states with lower taxes, unquote. Republicans have long used this idea that businesses are going to flee the state, and so long now that it's almost become a crying wolf,
Right.
to people. So talk seriously about what, I'm not saying to you talk
Right.
seriously, but just saying Minnesotans want straight talk about what's really going to happen. The businesses aren't going to run away, but they may hire less.
Correct.
Right?
I
They
mean,
may,
I think
let's talk about
that's-
what's really going to happen.
I think that's where if you get, obviously if you can hear one end of the maybe the hyperbole that goes into speech, you get the idea that every business is going to put their store on
Right.
jacks and drive it over to Wisconsin. That's not how it works. But each and every time and that's where these things are more long term, and it's more
Yeah.
long term signals, and that's again where I get back to. Oftentimes, even proposals can be just as dangerous as what's enacted if they believe it's a possibility.
Yeah.
Because then, when a business looks at it and it's now making a decision to expand its facilities or start a new operation or something, well, now they look at it, they look at paper, and they say, well, we could do that in Austin, Minnesota, or we can do that in Austin, Texas. Our prospects of Austin, Texas being a long-term better environment for us are better, we're going to go there.
Right.
And so now they expanded there. And the problem is once that anchor starts to move and that
Yeah.
momentum changes, that's where you see oftentimes businesses, they first expand someplace else, and next thing you know, they close their Minnesota operation, they've moved the headquarters.
Well, it's a free
so
market.
it isn't something that
Yeah.
happens in a month or a week or a year, but it does have effects over time. And I think almost any economist would say that you have. And again, I'll go
Well,
back.
you create an environment favorable to business, but at the same time, Republicans, it almost seems when you're up here that the Democrats only care about the poor and the downtrodden,
Right.
and the Republicans only care about businesses.
Sure.
The truth is not that in
Right.
reality, and we understand that everybody's different, and
Right.
But if you hear people talk and the talking points they use, a lot of times the public gets that impression.
Well,
And it may be the Republicans have failed in their messaging
Sure.
to say, hey, there is such a thing as compassionate conservatism, and here's, I don't know, and maybe Democrats are failing by saying they always hate business, or they don't
Yeah.
support business, because they do.
Right.
A lot of them have businesses in their backyards.
Yeah, but one thing when you look at the taxes, going back to taxes again, and what Representative Barrett said,
Yeah.
and I think is a failure on the Democrats if they say things like it doesn't have an effect, because in other points in taxation that they acknowledge that it has an effect. They claim
Right, you can't have it both
right,
ways.
they claim when they raise cigarette tax that will decrease people smoking. Well, if that then would hold true that if you increase, and many people have said that about the gas tax. Many people have said people that are on the green side of the spectrum say let's raise gas taxes because that'll induce people to drive less. So I think to say that taxation has no effect on people's actions is something that's only invoked apparently when it suits a purpose. So
Yeah.
I think that's a little disingenuous.
Yeah, and certainly not relegated to just the DFL and that particular argument. Both sides do it.
Sure.
It tends to be as you said, hyperbole or talking
Right.
points. But when you go to Republican school or Democrat school and they show you the list of talking points,
Right.
and you go in there, if you just repeat them constantly, I mean, pretty soon the public is, we're bored with it. We can
Right.
figure it out. It's not really manifesting itself that way in our lives, or it's worse
Right.
than you're telling us, and we know it. So.
Well, I never
To your
read my
point.
talking point sheet, so.
No, I get the feeling you don't. I'm wondering how long you'll stick around up here with such a, common sense view. Well, let's talk about that for a second, because you took a vote this year, and I don't know if we're the first media outlet you spoke to about it, but I think you've talked a little bit about it, your vote, but I want to ask you a serious question, put you on the spot a little bit. Was this a vote to cut the deal for the amendment, or was this a vote of your conscience?
It was, there's a lot that went into this vote.
Maybe it's more
I think-
complicated.
I think it's it's a difficult thing. I think it's obviously it's an issue that the state and the country have been dealing with for a number
We're
of
talking
years.
about the same-sex marriage vote that came
Correct.
up. 4 Republicans voted in favor of it.
Yes.
You were one of them.
Yeah, and I will say that what is concerning to me is when some people were talking that and they use the phrases like freedom and things like that, they then are on the other hand not concerned about going the other direction and infringing on someone else's freedom.
You mean like religious freedom?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think when we look, and I think that's a challenge to be put to this legislature, and it was when I spoke, my attempt to make that.
Which was the first time you'd ever spoken on the House
Which was the
floor. Yeah.
first time I ever spoke on the House floor.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not my intention to save it for that. In fact, I lost a $100 bet with Joe McDonald that I could go the entire session without talking. I said they have enough people on the floor that talk all the time. I don't need to be one of them. And but I put out there, and this is my belief that liberty shouldn't be about winners and losers. And if you think that there's a place that liberty isn't being allowed, then you need to be very careful that in the allowance of that you don't place a new restriction on someone else's liberty. And I think that's always it may be a tough balance. It may not always be easy to see, but I hope it's something that people are watchful and not. Freedom and liberty shouldn't be a winners and losers situation.
Right.
And that's my belief. And I think with going through with the amendment on a vote that was going to pass. I mean, we went through and talked about the majority party doesn't bring big issues when it has the votes to the floor for them to fail. It's just not something they're going to do.
Right. Yeah.
And
they count them all up before
they
it
called
gets
them all
there.
up,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I'm sure they didn't bring 6,000 people to the Capitol to watch something fail, of which they would be the only people available to blame. I mean,
Yeah, right.
they had the majorities, so.
So you knew it was
its
gonna
passage
pass.
was a foregone conclusion, and as I came to terms with that, and the realization of that, I looked at some of the things, and I ended up doing what I thought was best to build in every possible protection to the church and religious institutions to not have their deeply held beliefs pushed aside in an attempt to grant someone else a freedom or a right.
And in doing so, did you exercise your own conscience about same-sex marriage? Do you feel like it belongs where it ended up? Are you comfortable with where it ended up?
My belief and my position was we had reached a point where same-sex marriage in the
you're not that old, so it's like there's different viewpoints.
Yeah.
I understand this,
but we had
age,
come to a point, obviously, in this state and the political reality where same-sex marriage on the civil side.
If you don't know somebody who's gay,
was,
you know somebody who knows somebody who's
right. And so this
right.
that was going to happen. And again, it went back to I still have concerns about the bill. I'm worried about some of the things. And I also wanted to be able to put myself in a position to talk about this later, because I think we've seen many times that just when something's called over and done with, I had many people the last session say, well, you're lucky we solved the stadium issue for you, and lo and behold, it is unsolved. Right. And so I think it's really easy to think in a legislature when something passes that it's solved for eternity, and it rarely is. Things come back up, and we have to deal with it again. Yeah. And I hope to be in a position to, anytime we can make sure that as many citizens, freedom and liberties are preserved and expanded. That's what I want to see.
Well, that sounds like a very libertarian viewpoint on the issue.
Well, I've been accused of being a libertarian at times.
Well, you seem to have a farmer's kind of approach to this whole thing. Not that you don't. You're wearing your boots.
I got my boots, yeah.
You got your boots on. And do you think you brought that to the legislature with you? Do you think you carried your constituents' viewpoints up to the extent you could? And what was it like being a freshman and bringing that? And do you feel like common sense still has a place up here after what you've seen?
I hope so. I think, talking with a lot of the
at least your brand of common sense.
Yeah, at least my brand of common sense. So what other brand is there, right? I think there's talking to some of the older members, I've really come to appreciate some of them. I had a conversation shortly before adjournment last night with Gene Pulowski, and he's a guy I really look up to. On the other side of the aisle, obviously, and I'm sure doesn't share all my viewpoints, but I think he comes from the old school of the legislature that we're supposed to have our discussions. Another guy is Bob Gunther, a friend on my side of the aisle from Fairmont, and I think there's an appetite amongst people to have a little more of maybe what's kind of called now seen as the old style or the old school of the legislature, where there's a little more give and take and a little more discussion, and maybe a little more respect, across the aisle. And if I can do anything to help that, I sure hope I can.
Excellent. Cliff, anything from any questions out there from the Twitter sphere or the universe?
The question that's been popping up is what's next for the Republican Party for 2014? Is anybody thinking that far ahead?
Well,
I think everybody's
trouble.
always looking ahead to the next election cycle in this building and many others like it. Obviously, I want to see our party succeed, and no offense to Representative Lincheski, but I've asked for her seat on the floor if we take the majority, because as long as I'm sitting on that side of the room, then it means we're in the majority.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So I'm going to work very hard on my end to help Republican candidates and win legislative seats. And obviously the governor's race is up, and so that's going to be very pivotal on what happens in the future and the direction. Obviously, in either case, even if Republicans, sweep and take a majority in the House and take the governorship, we'd still have a very solidly Democratic Party Senate, and so I think it would be a shift, but it wouldn't be wouldn't be seismic. There would still be another party to contend with, which would bring us back into a lot more of our Minnesota's typical pattern of having a form of divided government.
So we got Scott Honor.
Yes.
Jeff Johnson.
Correct.
And I know Senator Han has talked a little bit about considering a run. How about your old friend Tom Emmer? He said he's not interested, but he said that before. What do you think? Where's the next candidate going to come from?
I think for one thing you mentioned, Senator Han, obviously, and there's been some other legislators, House and Senate, that have been discussed. So I think the end of session here, obviously, begins their window of
they better get moving pretty soon, right?
Yeah, Honor and Johnson only announced, maybe 3 and
Weeks
4 weeks
ago,
ago
yeah,
or something
yep.
like that. So it isn't too far into the season. I think, people definitely give it a little time. So I think through this summer we'll start to see the field get set where it's at, but I think that there oftentimes is still a lot of room in this process until much later, depending on the candidates in and the candidates looking to get in.
Dayton's still polling pretty high among Minnesotans. That hasn't changed much since he's taken office. Is he going to be tough to run against?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I've never underestimated Governor Dayton. I certainly didn't do so or ask people to do so. He's a very sharp guy. I think some of the ways he does things actually kind of lull people into underestimating him, and he takes advantage of it. And I think he's obviously proven himself, to be someone that's a force to be reckoned with and contend with. That being said, I mean, there's been a lot of things that happen that create openings. Like I said, I mean, he proposed a lot of taxes on the front of this thing, and a lot of them didn't come through, but he proposed them and he backed them. Maybe later to find out they were less popular than he thought, and retracted a little bit.
All those advisors have been fired.
All those ones, you get new advisors.
Yeah, that's right.
The easy solution. The benefits of being an executive, maybe. But
right.
I think it's going to be a hard-fought race. And Minnesota obviously is a place where we're used to seeing that.
Well, it's been great talking to you, and always interesting to watch you on the floor, even though you don't talk a lot. I do see some movement once in a while.
I move around a little bit.
Yes, and it's interesting to hear your perspectives as a freshman up here. I'm sure you heard a lot of the stories about what it was like to be in the majority because your party was there, and then suddenly, you get elected. It's evaporated.
I don't think it was my fault, but
no, not necessarily. No, but. When you came up here, you didn't have the same opportunity.
No, I think it's coming in as a freshman minority member, you're definitely about as low man on the totem pole as you get. I think there's not a lot of room for maneuver. There's not a lot you can do. You don't really hold a lot of chips and.
But just thinking about our viewers' question to you, and not just about the future, but what do you do? In a sense, what do you do when you're in the majority and you don't have that kind of weight, and then you're because of some of the actions of your former colleagues in the legislature preceding you kind of suffered the consequences of their quote unquote overreach.
Sure.
But to that question, I think getting at that, Republicans said they were going to have to do some soul searching. Mm-hmm. And some national Republicans came out and said, look, we're changing our position on same-sex marriage, going to be a bigger tent, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Does that have to happen at the local level in order to win another election in Minnesota?
Well, I think a lot of it is there. I mean, I think there is
the Tea Party over. I mean, is that where?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think some, and maybe there's still some room for improvement, but I think Republicans, accept that not every Republican thinks exactly the same, and you find, but again, going back to the old Reagan principles of, I think he said 80% even, right? 80%. That's actually relatively low.
Yeah.
So, I think because some people would like it to be 99%, but it isn't that way, and I think there's. Looking at members in my caucus and the Democrats have the same thing. You're in a legislative body, you really see that firsthand. That there's some varying opinions, and you got to find a way to make it work and stick together when you need to, but have your varying opinions when you don't. I obviously on a few things I've been very much out on my own. I mentioned in my speech I was one of, I think, only 8 members that voted for Sunday liquor sales.
Well, when you're busy on the farm all week, you got to do something.
You got to do something on Sunday.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Representative FitzSimmons, for being on the program. And
Thank you, Marty.
yeah, you bet. And as an honored guest, a member of the show, we're going to send you and a guest on a trip somewhere.
Oh, great.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
We don't do any of that. Probably be to the farm or something. No, we don't
Send
do
me
any of
send
that.
me home. Is that where?
Yeah, send you back. Well, you won't. You'll be glad to get some rest, won't you?
Yes,
Haven't you been on a pretty,
it'll be good. I think everybody was ready for the session to be over
Yeah.
and get back to life. And we have a citizen legislature, which I think is the way that we need to keep it. And because we go back to our real lives, and I got to drive my son to school and do some laundry and make sure to keep you humble.
Yeah, well, and your staff too, right? The hundreds of people up here support legislators. And
There's some amazing people in our partisan staff that we have, and I've got to know some on the Democrat partisan staff, and some great people. We mentioned Al in our conversations earlier,
Yeah.
who really runs the legislature, and the people at the desk. Daisha over on our
Yeah.
side hallway, she's great, and there's some amazing people that
Murph, yeah.
Yep,
yeah,
that keep this
sure.
thing running.
Good.
So really appreciate them.
Well, good to
And
have
Steve in his retirement.
you. Yeah, that's right. Good, he got a standing ovation.
He
yeah,
got
as you said.
as long. I believe some of the older members said they've never heard a longer ovation, and Steve keeps the electronics in this place running. So that's quite a feat.
Good promotion for IT kids out there.
There
Keep
you
going
go.
to school.
Exactly. You may get a standing ovation
You
someday.
may one day receive that. Well, good luck to you, David FitzSimmons, and we'll
Thank you, Marty. Thank you.
see you soon back up here. You got one more.
Sounds great.
At least one more session to go.
At least one more.
Maybe more.
Thank
Okay, thanks very much. That's it for tonight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at MN Capital News and on Facebook at Minnesota Capital MN Capital Conversations. And if you send us a good question, we'll ask it on the show, although that's it for this season. We're going to wrap up the show tonight, and that'll be our last show of the season. It's been about 18 or 19 weeks, so we're coming to an end. For more political analysis and news, follow us on KFAI's Morning Blend at 7:30 every Wednesday morning at 90.3 FM on the dial. We had media production all session long from our wonderful producer, Catherine Loudenslager, who does a great job for us, and she's shaking her head right now, but she's just fantastic, and I just wanted to give a public shout out to her. She's been awesome, and she's never missed a show. Also to our social media producer, who's Cliff Dahlberg, and Cliff's done great. That's my alert to don't forget to thank Cliff Dahlberg, and really appreciate everything he's done on the program. So thank you, Cliff. Great job. And all of the people behind the scenes who help promote and make the show possible. And for my past co-host, Paul Gardner, and part-time co-host, Andy Friedel, I'm Marty Owings. We'll see you at the Capitol.